Good evening. I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. This evening I'm going to be reading a few stories by Stephen Leacock. The first story was originally published in 1910, and it's called The Awful Fate of Melpomenus Jones. Some people, not you or I, because we are so awfully self-possessed, but some people find great difficulty in saying goodbye when making a call or spending the evening. As the moment draws near when the visitor feels that he is fairly entitled to go away, he rises and says abruptly, "Well, I think I..." And then the people say, "Oh, must you go now? Surely it's early yet." And a pitiful struggle ensues. I think the saddest case of this kind of thing that I ever knew was that of my poor friend Melpomenus Jones, a curate. Such a dear young man and only 23. He simply couldn't get away from people. He was too modest to tell a lie and too religious to wish to appear rude. Now it happened that he went to call on some friends of his on the very first afternoon of his summer vacation. The next 6 weeks were entirely his own, absolutely nothing to do. He chatted a while, drank 2 cups of tea, then braced himself for the effort and said suddenly, "Well, I think I..." But the lady of the house said, "Oh, no, Mr. Jones, can't you really stay a little longer?" Jones was always truthful. "Oh, yes," he said, "of course I can stay." "Then please don't go." He stayed. He drank 11 cups of tea. Night was falling. He rose again. "Well, now," he said shyly, "I really think "You must go," said the lady politely. "I thought perhaps you could have stayed to dinner." "Oh, well, so I could, you know," Jones said, "Then please stay. I'm sure my husband will be delighted." "All right," he said feebly, "I'll stay." And he sank back into his chair, just full of tea and miserable. Papa came home. They had dinner. All through the meals, Jones sat planning to leave at 8:30. All the family wondered whether Mr. Jones was stupid or sulky, or just stupid. After dinner, Mama undertook to draw him out and showed him photographs. She showed him all the family museum, several gross of them, photos of Papa's uncle and his wife, and Mama's brother and his little boy, an awfully interesting photo of Papa's uncle's friend in his Bengal uniform, an awfully well-taken photo of Papa's grandfather's partner's dog, and an awfully wicked one of Papa as the devil for a fancy dress ball. At 8:30, Jones had examined 71 photographs. There were about 69 more that he hadn't. Jones rose. "I must say good night now," he pleaded. "Say good night," they said. "Why, it's only 8:30. Have you anything to do?" "Nothing," he admitted, and muttered something about staying 6 weeks, and then laughed miserably. Just then it turned out that the favorite child of the family, such a dear little romp, had hidden Mr. Jones's hat. So Papa said he must stay and invited him to a pipe and a chat. Papa had the pipe and gave Jones the chat, and still he stayed. Every moment he meant to take the plunge, but couldn't. Then Papa began to get very tired of Jones, and fidgeted and finally said with jocular irony that Jones had better stay all night, that they could give him a shakedown. Jones mistook his meaning and thanked him with tears in his eyes, and Papa put Jones to bed in the spare room and cursed him heartily. After breakfast next day, Papa went off to his work in the city and left Jones playing with the baby, broken-hearted. His nerve was utterly gone. He was meaning to leave all day, but the thing had got on his mind, and he simply couldn't. When Papa came home in the evening, he was surprised and chagrined to find Jones still there. He thought to jockey him out with a jest, and said he thought he'd have to charge him for his board, hee. The unhappy young man stared wildly for a moment, then wrung Papa's hands, paid him a month's board in advance, and broke down and sobbed like a child. In the days that followed, he was moody and unapproachable. He lived, of course, entirely in the drawing-room, and the lack of air and exercise began to tell sadly on his health. He passed his time in drinking tea and looking at the photographs. He would stand for hours gazing at the photographs of Papa's uncle's friend in his Bengal uniform, talking to it, sometimes swearing bitterly at it. His mind was visibly failing. At length the crash came. They carried him upstairs in a raging delirium of fever. The illness that followed was terrible. He recognized no one, not even Papa's uncle's friend in his Bengal uniform. At times he would start up from his bed and shriek, "Well, I think and then fall back upon the pillow with a horrible laugh. Then again he would leap up and cry, "Another cup of tea and more photographs, more photographs." At length, after a month of agony, on the last day of his vacation, he passed away. They say that when the last moment came, he sat up in bed with a beautiful smile of confidence playing upon his face, and said, "Well, the angels are calling me. I'm afraid I really must go now. Good afternoon." And the rushing of his spirit from its prison house was as rapid as a hunted cat passing over a garden fence. The end. So the second story from Stephen Leacock is from a book called Nonsense Novels. It was published in 1911, and the book contains satirical versions of several popular genres of the time. And the story I'm going to read this evening is a takeoff on a romantic drama. So let's get started. Gertrude the Governess, or Simple 17. Synopsis of previous chapters. There are no previous chapters. It was a wild and stormy night on the west coast of Scotland. This, however, is immaterial to the present story, as the scene is not laid in the west of Scotland. For the matter of that, the weather was just as bad on the east coast of Ireland. But the scene of this narrative is laid in the south of England, and takes place around Nascentium Towers, pronounced as if written Nosham Tawes, the seat of Lord Knockasent, pronounced as if written Nosh. But it is not necessary to pronounce either of these names in reading them. Nosham Tawes was a typical English home. The main part of the house was an Elizabethan structure of warm red brick, while the elder portion, of which the Earl was inordinately proud, still showed the outlines of a Norman keep, to which had been added a Lancastrian jail and a Plantagenet orphan asylum. From the house in all directions stretched magnificent woodland and park, with oaks and elms of immemorial antiquity, while nearer the house stood raspberry bushes and geranium plants which had been set out by the Crusaders. About the grand old mansion the air was loud with the chirping of thrushes, the cawing of partridges, and the clear, sweet note of the rook, while deer, antelope, and other quadrupeds strutted about the lawn, so tame as to eat off the sundial. In fact, the place was a regular menagerie. From the house downwards through the park stretched a beautiful broad avenue laid out by Henry VIII. Lord Nosh stood upon the hearthrug of the library. Trained diplomat and statesman as he was, his stern, aristocratic face was upside down with fury. "Boy," he said, "you shall marry this girl, or I disinherit you. You are no son of mine." Young Lord Ronald, erect before him, flung back a glance as defiant as his own. "I defy you," he said. "Henceforth you are no father of mine. I will get another. I will marry none but a woman I can love. This girl that we have never seen—" "Fool," said the Earl. "Would you throw aside our state and name of 1,000 years? The girl, I am told, is beautiful. Her aunt is willing. They are French. Pah! They understand such things in France." "But your reason—" "I give no reason," said the Earl. "Listen, Ronald, I give 1 month. For that time you remain here. If at the end of it you refuse me, I cut you off with a shilling." Lord Ronald said nothing. He flung himself from the room, flung himself upon his horse, and rode madly off in all directions. As the door of the library closed upon Ronald, the Earl sank into a chair. His face changed. It was no longer that of the haughty nobleman, but of the hunted criminal. "He must marry the girl," he muttered. "Soon she will know all. Tuchumov has escaped from Siberia. He knows and will tell. The whole of the mines passed to her, this property with it, and but enough. He rose, walked to the sideboard, drained a dipperful of gin and bitters, and became again a high-bred English gentleman. It was at this moment that a high dog-cart, driven by a groom of the livery of Earl Nosh, might have been seen entering the avenue of Nosham Taws. Beside him sat a young girl, scarce more than a child, in fact, not so nearly as big as the groom. The apple pie hat which she wore, surmounted with black willow plumes, concealed from view a face so face-like in its appearance as to be positively facial. It was, need we say it, Gertrude the Governess, who was this day to enter upon her duties at Nosham Taws. At the same time that the dog-cart entered the avenue at one end, there might have been seen riding down it from the other a tall young man, whose long aristocratic face proclaimed his birth, and who was mounted upon a horse with a face even longer than his own. And who is this tall young man, who draws nearer to Gertrude with every revolution of the horse? Ah, who indeed? Ah, who? I wonder if any of my readers could guess that this was none other than Lord Ronald. The two were destined to meet. Nearer and nearer they came, and then still nearer. Then for one brief moment they met. As they passed, Gertrude raised her eyes and directed toward the young nobleman 2 eyes so eye-like in their expression as to be absolutely circular, which Lord Ronald directed toward the occupant of a dog-cart, a gaze so gaze-like that nothing but a gazelle or a gas-pipe could have emulated its intensity. Was this the dawn of love? Wait and see. Do not spoil the story. Let us speak of Gertrude. Gertrude de Mormency McFiggin had known neither father nor mother. They had both died years before she was born. Of her mother she knew nothing, save that she was French, was extremely beautiful, and that all her ancestors and even her business acquaintances had perished in the Revolution. Yet Gertrude cherished the memory of her parents. On her breast the girl wore a locket in which was enshrined a miniature of her mother, while down her neck inside the back hung a daguerreotype of her father. She carried a portrait of her grandmother up her sleeve and had pictures of her cousins tucked inside her boot, while beneath her, but enough, quite enough. Of her father, Gertrude knew even less, that he was a high-born English gentleman who had lived as a wanderer in many lands. This was all she knew. His only legacy to Gertrude had been a Russian grammar, a Romanian phrase-book, a theodolite, and a work on mining engineering. From her earliest infancy, Gertrude had been brought up by her aunt. Her aunt had carefully instructed her in Christian principles. She had also taught her Mohammedanism, to be sure. When Gertrude was 17, her aunt had died of hydrophobia. The circumstances were mysterious. There had called upon her that day a strange, bearded man in the costume of the Russians. After he had left, Gertrude found her aunt in a syncope from which she passed into an apostrophe and never recovered. To avoid scandal, it was called hydrophobia. Gertrude was thus thrown upon the world. What to do? That was the problem that confronted her. It was while musing one day upon her fate that Gertrude's eye was struck with an advertisement. Wanted, a governess. Must possess a knowledge of French, Italian, Russian, and Romanian. Music and mining engineering. Salary, £1, 4 shillings and 4 pence halfpenny per annum. Apply between 11:30 and 25 minutes to 12 at number 41, A.6, Belgravia Terrace, the Countess of Nosh. Gertrude was a girl of great natural quickness of apprehension, and she had not pondered over this announcement more than half an hour before she was struck with the extraordinary coincidence between the list of items desired and the things she herself knew. She duly presented herself at Belgravia Terrace before the Countess, who advanced to meet her with a charm which at once placed the girl at her ease. "You are proficient in French?" she asked. "Oh, oui," said Gertrude modestly. "And Italian?" continued the Countess. "Oh, si," said Gertrude. "And German?" said the Countess in delight. "Ah, ja," said Gertrude. "And Russian?" "Ja." "And Romanian?" "Yup." Amazed at the girl's extraordinary proficiency in modern languages, the Countess looked at her narrowly. Where had she seen those lineaments before? She passed her hand over her brow in thought and spit upon the floor. But no, the face baffled her. Enough, she said. I engage you on the spot. Tomorrow you go down to Nosham Taws and begin teaching the children. I must add that in addition you will be expected to aid the Earl with his Russian correspondence. He has large mining interests at Chminsk. Chminsk? Why did this simple word reverberate upon Gertrude's ears? Why? Because it was the name written in her father's hand on the title page of his book on mining. What mystery was here? It was on the following day that Gertrude had driven up the avenue. She descended from the dog-cart, passed through a phalanx of liveried servants drawn up 7 deep, to each of whom she gave a sovereign as she passed and entered Nosham Taws. Welcome, said the Countess, and she aided Gertrude to carry her trunk upstairs. The girl presently descended and was ushered into the library, where she was presented to the Earl. As soon as the Earl's eye fell upon the face of the new governess, he started visibly. Where had he seen those lineaments? Where was it? At the races or the theater? On a bus? But no. Some subtler thread of memory was stirring in his mind. He strode hastily to the sideboard, drained a dipper and a half of brandy, and became again the perfect English gentleman. While Gertrude was gone to the nursery to make the acquaintance of the 2 tiny golden-haired children who are to be her charges, let us say something here of the Earl and his son. Lord Nosh was the perfect type of the English nobleman and statesman. The years he had spent in the diplomatic service at Constantinople, St. Petersburg, and Salt Lake City had given him a particular finesse and noblesse, while his long residence at St. Helena, Pitcairn Island, and Hamilton, Ontario, had rendered him impervious to external impressions. As deputy paymaster of the militia of the county, he had seen something of the sterner side of military life, while his hereditary office of groom of the Sunday breeches had brought him into direct contact with royalty itself. His passion for outdoor sports endeared him to his tenants. A keen sportsman, he excelled at fox hunting, dog hunting, pig killing, bat catching, and the pastimes of his class. In this latter respect, Lord Ronald took after his father. From the start, the lad had shown the greatest promise. At Eton, he had made a splendid showing at battledore and shuttlecock, and at Cambridge had been first in his class at needlework. Already his name was whispered in connection with the All-England Ping-Pong Championship, a triumph which would undoubtedly carry with it a seat in Parliament. Thus was Gertrude the Governess installed at Nosham Taws. The days and the weeks sped past. The simple charm of the beautiful orphan girl attracted all hearts. Her 2 little pupils became her slaves. "Me love you," the little Rasha Frida would say, leaning her golden head in Gertrude's lap. Even the servants loved her. The head gardener would bring a bouquet of beautiful roses to her room before she was up. The second gardener a bunch of early cauliflowers. The third a spray of late asparagus. And even the 10th and 11th a sprig of wrangle myrtle of an armful of hay. Her room was full of gardeners all the time, while at evening the aged butler, touched at the friendless girl's loneliness, would tap softly at her door to bring her a rye whiskey and seltzer or a box of Pittsburgh stogies. Even the dumb creatures seemed to admire her in their own dumb way. The dumb rook settled on her shoulder, and every dumb dog around the place followed her. And Ronald, Ronald, yes, indeed, they had met. They had spoken. What a dull morning, Gertrude had said. Quel triste matin. Was für ein allverdamner Tag. Beastly, Ronald had answered. Beastly. The word rang in Gertrude's ears all day. After that, they were constantly together. They played tennis and ping-pong in the day, and in the evening, in accordance with the stiff routine of the place, they sat down with the Earl and Countess to 25-cent poker, and still later they sat together on the veranda and watched the moon sweeping in great circles around the horizon. It was not long before Gertrude realized that Lord Ronald felt towards her a warmer feeling than that of mere ping-pong. At times in her presence he would fall, especially after dinner, into a fit of profound subtraction. Once at night, when Gertrude withdrew to her chamber, and before seeking her pillow, prepared to retire as a preliminary to disrobing, in other words, before going to bed, she flung wide the casement, opened the window, and saw, the face of Lord Ronald. He was sitting on a thorn bush beneath her, and his upturned face wore an expression of agonized pallor. Meanwhile, the days passed. Life at the Taws moved in the ordinary routine of a great English household. At 7 a gong sounded for rising. At 8 a horn blew for breakfast. At 8:30 a whistle sounded for prayers. At 1 a flag was run up half-mast for lunch. At 4 a gun was fired for afternoon tea. At 9 the first bell sounded for dressing. At 9:15 a second bell for going on dressing, while at 9:30 a rocket was sent up to indicate that dinner was ready. At midnight dinner was over, and at 1 a.m. the tolling of a bell summoned the domestics to evening prayers. Meanwhile, the month allotted by the Earl to Lord Ronald was passing away. It was already July 15th. Then within a day or two it was July 17th, and almost immediately afterwards, July 18th. At times the Earl, in passing Ronald in the hall, would say sternly, "Remember, boy, your consent or I disinherit you." And what were the Earl's thoughts of Gertrude? Here was the one drop of bitterness in the girl's cup of happiness. For some reason that she could not divine, the Earl showed signs of marked antipathy. Once as she passed the door of the library, he threw a boot-jack at her. On another occasion, at lunch, alone with her, he struck her savagely across the face with a sausage. It was her duty to translate to the Earl his Russian correspondence. She sought in it in vain for the mystery. One day a Russian telegram was handed to the Earl. Gertrude translated it to him aloud. "Tuchimov went to the woman. She is dead." On hearing this, the Earl became livid with fury. In fact, this was the day that he struck her with the sausage. Then one day, while the Earl was absent on a bat hunt, Gertrude, who was turning over his correspondence, with that sweet feminine instinct of interest that rose superior to ill treatment, suddenly found the key to the mystery. Lord Nosh was not the rightful owner of the Taws. His distant cousin of the older line, the true heir, had died in a Russian prison to which the machinations of the Earl, while ambassador at Minsk, had consigned him. The daughter of this cousin was the true owner of the Taws. The family story, save only that the documents before her withheld the name of the rightful heir, lay bare to Gertrude's eye. Strange is the heart of a woman. Did Gertrude turn from the Earl with spurning? No, her own sad fate had taught her sympathy. Yet the mystery remained. Why did the Earl start perceptibly each time that he looked into her face? Sometimes he started as much as 4 centimeters, so that one could distinctly see him do it. On such occasion he would hastily drain a dipper of rum and Vichy water and become once again the correct English gentleman. The denouement came swiftly. Gertrude never forgot it. It was the night of the great ball at Nosham Taws. The whole neighborhood was invited. How Gertrude's heart had beat with anticipation, and with what trepidation she had overhauled her scant wardrobe in order to appear not unworthy in Lord Ronald's eyes. Her resources were poor indeed, yet the inborn genius for dress that she inherited from her French mother stood her in good stead. She twined a single rose in her hair, and contrived herself a dress out of a few old newspapers and the inside of an umbrella that would have graced the court. Round her waist she bound a single braid of bag-string, while a piece of old lace that had been her mother's was suspended to her ear by a thread. Gertrude was the cynosure of all eyes. Floating to the strains of the music, she presented a picture of bright girlish innocence that no one could see disenraptured. The ball was at its height. It was way up. Ronald stood with Gertrude in the shrubbery. They looked into one another's eyes. "Gertrude," he said, "I love you." Simple words, yet they thrilled every fiber in the girl's costume. "Ronald," she said, and cast herself about his neck. At this moment the Earl appeared standing beside them in the moonlight. His stern face was distorted with indignation. "So," he said, turning to Ronald, "it appears you have chosen." "I have," said Ronald with hauteur. "You prefer to marry this penniless girl than the heiress I have selected for you?" Gertrude looked from father to son in amazement. "Yes," said Ronald. "Be it so," said the Earl, draining a dipper of gin which he carried, and resuming his calm. "Then I disinherit you. Leave this place, and never return to it." "Come, Gertrude," said Ronald tenderly, "let us flee together." Gertrude stood before them. The rose had fallen from her head. The lace had fallen from her ear, and the bag string had come undone from her waist. Her newspapers were crumpled beyond recognition. But disheveled and illegible as she was still mistress of herself. "Never," she said firmly. "Ronald, you shall never make this sacrifice for me." Then to the Earl in tones of ice, "There is a pride, sir, as great even as yours. The daughter of Metchnikoff Mephigin need crave a boon from no one." With that she hauled from her bosom the daguerreotype of her father and pressed it to her lips. The Earl started as if shot. "That name," he cried, "that face, that photograph. Stop!" There is no need to finish. My readers have long since divined it. Gertrude was the heiress. The lovers fell into one another's arms. The Earl's proud face relaxed. "God bless you," he said. The Countess and the guests came pouring out upon the lawn. The breaking day illuminated a scene of gay congratulations. Gertrude and Ronald were wed. Their happiness was complete. Need we say more? Yes, only this. The Earl was killed in a hunting field a few days after. The Countess was struck by lightning. The 2 children fell down a well. Thus the happiness of Gertrude and Ronald was complete. The end. Thank you very much for joining me, and have a very good week.